Well, South Africa's economic outlook remains weak and forecasted as 0.8% for the 2023 GDP growth. Now, it's been revised down to by 0.1 percentage point lower than the growth initially projected for 2023. And outlining the medium-term budget policy statement from Parliament in Cape Town yesterday, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said that South Africa's debt will rise from 4.8 trillion in 2023-24 to 5.2 trillion in the next financial year, and it will exceed the 6 trillion mark by 2025-2026. Some economists say that the budget statement has not come up with any growth strategies, and it continues to repeat the same concepts such as structural reforms with no real plan in place. And joining us in studio now to discuss some of this are Justice Coalition Steering Committee member Matshidiso Lencoasa, as well as Miyelani Maluleke, senior economist at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, and economist Lumkile Mondi from the Wits Business School. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. And let me start by getting your reactions to the medium-term budget policy statement yesterday. Of course, not much to be done at this stage, but, basically giving us a snapshot of how far we've come. But what is your immediate reaction? Miyelani, let's start with you.
Look, I think the message is very clear from the MTBPS, and that is we've got an economy that is not growing. Growth of 0.8% is not adequate for us to deal with the socioeconomic challenges that face us as a country. But the more immediate issue for the budget that stems from this weak growth environment is that it's proving to be very difficult to collect taxes, right? So in that space, the National Treasury is saying, we're struggling to generate growth. Revenues is coming in a bit weaker. We need to figure out how to balance the budget books, right? And they're saying we need to come up with a response to contain expenditure growth, not just in the current fiscal year, but in the years ahead, so that we make sure that public finances are sustainable. Now, that's a difficult message, I think, to send across, especially when you talk about budget cuts. But I think where we are right now in this environment where we're struggling to find growth, it is necessary, I think, for National Treasury to be sending that kind of message, saying we need to find a way to figure out how to balance things out so that we can have sustainability going forward.
Lumkile Mondi, government has been saying this for a very long time. We need to figure it out. We don't seem to be figuring it out.
Well, you can argue that, in fact, they've gone back to what they know very best. In the transition between 1993 and 1995, we're in the same position that we find ourselves in. And basically, with the homelands having spent so much, and national government having very few resources. However, that period is a very accommodating international environment. And more importantly, South Africa is not grey listed. SOEs are functioning. So the environment that we've traveled and the lessons that we learned through the growth, employment and redistribution strategy are the ones I think the minister has gone back through and said, you know what, we were in this position over 30 years ago. Let me take that menu and implement it. So I see it as another part of the ANC learning. Inherited a bankrupt economy, turned it around, and make it work very, very well. And suddenly lost control and found itself where it is today.
So, Matshidiso, if we look at the borrowing and what we are paying, 1.5 billion rand per day, according to what the minister said yesterday, and what we'll be borrowing over the next 3 years, that's what we'll be paying back, 1.5 billion per day. That's staggering.
Yeah, so it is very concerning, and I'd like to come in from a human rights perspective, is that the budget and these budget cuts and the way that we're funding this is, not sustainable from a fiscal position. And I think it is important to look for fiscal sustainability, but we see it as not at the expense of human rights. So there are constitutional rights of education, healthcare, nutrition, among others, and it is crucial that the fiscal policy plays a role in resourcing, ensuring that there's available resources to protect that. And so looking at debt servicing costs that rise over the years, over the past 10 years, civil society has actually critiqued that approach because it overlooks the human rights aspect. And I know it's a tough position for National Treasury and policymakers to be in, but we recommend that whichever way they go about funding, it needs to be cognizant and it needs to center human rights. So with interest on debt over the past decade, what it has meant is that it reduces the funding available for education and healthcare, which means that it is the most marginalized people in the country who bear the greatest burden, even though these fiscal measures impact all of us, particularly women in underserved communities who we found that they mask the impact of these budget constraints with their unpaid care work.
And I want us to have a conversation, so please feel free to, indicate when you want to add to that. Because before you go, Miyelani, I just want to ask about education, for example. Given as a line item how much we spend on education as a nation, is there as a return on investment?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. South Africa's education system is deeply under there's a lot of overcrowding in schools, and we still see that even though there has been large allocations to education, particularly 2 decades ago, so a few administrations before, we found that our education outcomes are still very low. However, we still think that it's crucial to bolster the funding. We see that if you cut the funding towards areas like education infrastructure, that threatens the ability to build classrooms that are not made of inappropriate materials. Currently, there are people and learners in the country who are risking their lives to achieve education. Education outcomes we're not necessarily seeing a good investment, but we caution that responding to a poor investment by cutting the budget, actually we're punishing the school learners who had no role to play in making these budget decisions. And also we might be eroding investments in education today, and we'll see the impacts of that today, but also when the children of today end up being adults and they have to make decisions. So it's almost similar to the ESCOM crisis, where taking money from one area to another, and we'll worry about that problem later. As we see today, we have that load shedding problem. So as our former deputy president, Phumzile Mlambo Mngcuku, once said, that we essentially are load shedding the school children of South Africa.
Miyelani?
I wanted to comment just briefly on Sili's point, because I completely agree with what she's saying. But I actually think that this is also National Treasury's point here, right? And I want to tie this in with your earlier question about debt service costs. So we're talking here today, you're talking about these figures that we're spending per day trying to service debt. Let's take a bit of a more historical look. I think about 10 years ago, we're probably spending more on basic education than we are on debt service costs per annum. But we're talking here today, we are spending more on debt service costs than we are on basic education. Debt service costs are taking up about 20 rands of every 100 rands that the government is collecting in tax revenues. So the more debt you accumulate, the more these debt service costs are just going to keep going up. And the issue with debt service costs is that you can't negotiate, right? Once you have debt and those costs are there, they are there, and that forces you to then think about what are the things that you have to cut. So the National Treasury is actually saying, how do we protect spending on these things that are critical? Education, particularly basic education. How do we protect spending on social services? How do we protect spending on policing, etc.? But keeping public finances sustainable over the longer run. And they're putting a message out there to say, here's a proposal. We're saying we need to be innovative in terms of finding areas to cut some spending while protecting those essential services, but making sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation 10 years down the line where, we're having to spend even more on debt service costs and having to, I think, allocate even less to these critical services.
I'm not sure what's innovative about it, but maybe you'll tell me. Lumkile?
No, I was going to say just on education that it's not about the money. I think there are deep-seated problems within our education system at basic level. I mean, Nick Paul has written extensively about the issues, whether it is the teachers themselves who are teaching subject with no content whatsoever. They don't know, but they're supposed to teach that. To corruption around provision of infrastructure, be it latrines, be it classrooms, etc. To this the feeding schemes that Mandela introduced, and children not getting access to that food. So there's deeper issues, not the money. I think spending 20% education, you are doing extremely well as a country. The issue that we need to do is how can we improve across various areas, from the teacher training to the school infrastructure to the hierarchy of recruitment, because there have been a lot of writings about the power of trade unions and how they've become themselves human capital people who recruit and decide who goes elsewhere. So there's a whole lot of issues there. So for me, in education, I think the amount that we allocate is enough. Then you have to deal with the real problems. And then you go to other areas, including health, similar issues around procurement of medicine and how thieving and crooks have come into that space. So if we deal with those issues, then we can understand how effectively and efficiently we can use the limited resources that we have. So throwing money into these issues is not going to help us. We have to look back at ourselves around how we recruit in terms of capability, how we are using our resources, but also where there's wrong, people should pay. So you have to disincentivize thieving and corruption in our schools and across many areas of government.
And isn't this the problem across the board? Because you look at the money that we spend as a country, and again, that question of return on investment. What do we actually have to show for all the money that's being spent? And the million-dollar question, my apologies, and something that for some reason we don't seem to be able to crack is how to grow this economy. And for as long as people don't have jobs, all of these other issues are just going to be exacerbated.
Yeah. So the National Treasury actually makes this point in the MTBPS, and I think it's something that they've also been saying for quite some time now, that it's not obvious that spending more actually generates the sustained growth that we want. And you just have to look at the past 10, 15 years of public finances where we were running these very large budget deficits. And to your point, it's not clear that we have seen the return in terms of growth, in terms of actually trying to reduce the unemployment rate. So these calls that tend to be made quite often for the government to spend even more in that context where it's not evident that there's a very high rate of return on that spending, probably not taking us in the right direction. I think this is why we're at this point where National Treasury is saying, let us think about what the state is about. Let us think about how the state is currently sort of organized, and try to see whether there's actually ways in which we can reconfigure the way in which the state is sort of set up, so that we can do even better with the little that is available right now.
But how long are we going to be having these discussions for?
Yeah.
Because we probably heard this a decade ago, if not earlier. So how long are we going to keep regurgitating these same sentiments after each budget statement? Because if you think about it, the macroeconomic policy of the country, is that working for us? Is that perhaps one of the problems? Where should we be looking to for the answers? Because the population is growing, the economy is not growing. We need to disabuse ourselves of this fact about economic growth that is less than 1%. I mean, it's something that I don't understand. Every time, we've gone up by 0.1 of a percentage point. That's not growth. We can't be celebrating nothing.
Yeah, but I mean, the reality is that we know where growth is going to come from. Growth comes from investment. South Africa, unlike the rest of Africa, we've got a very strong private sector with a history with a very deep history from our mining sector, which in terms of technology leads the deep level mining, and through that, the manufacturing sector, etc. So those sectors, the capabilities there, the issues about state-business relationships, whereby Business for South Africa and many other formations have been talking and engaging our government around microeconomic reforms, which are very, very difficult. We all know around how the mining sector forgo capital returns because of failing port and rail infrastructure. We know the energy issue, how much impact it's had. So I'm saying basically that until our policymakers respond to business needs, whether it's small business or it's the larger businesses that run our economy, we need that response. If on rail, on electricity, and other areas such as security, where also business is experiencing high costs there across that area. So until the state responds to support government, to support business as a partner with all these microeconomic reforms, it's not very, very difficult for us to get growth growing. So I'm very
why
encouraged.
Aren't we getting there?
I'm very encouraged. I mean, the president says the right things, but the actions are something else. So until we see that partnership between state and business, that drives that, because that partnership is critical to bring those outside the labor market, to ensure that the issues of talking about education happen, because remember, the beneficiaries of the skill coming of education are the business themselves. So if it's falling, they themselves are not sustainable. So until we get that state-business relationship going, I think we're going to struggle and keep on talking every day when we know what needs to be done.
Matshidiso, before I come to you, Miyelani, okay, let me come to you because I want to take Matshidiso elsewhere.
I'm going to be brief and allow Matshidiso to also come in, but I just want to agree with Lumkile's point, and I think it's very important. We have these conversations quite regularly. I think you're absolutely right, Sakina. We know what needs to be done. We need more electricity supply. No one will disagree with that. We need rail that actually works, that can move goods from one part of the country. We need roads that work well. We need ports that are efficient and they can move goods. We all agree on those things, but the fact that we don't have those things working the way that we all want speaks to one issue: implementation of what actually needs to be done. I think that's where the gap really has been in terms of how we move from where we want to be to where we actually should be.
And if we are being honest about it, we had those very entities that were functional, and we allowed them to be deteriorated to a point where they are now, needing a whole overhaul, as it were. Why is that happening? But Matshidiso, again, from a social perspective, the social relief of distress grant has now been extended by another year. And I don't think anybody will speak against that. Whether we have the money or not, we have to find the money, because the reality is that people are not working. So if they're not working, the state needs to provide some form of safety net. Whether it's sufficient or not is another debate altogether. But again, if you look at the number of South Africans who are dependent on some or other grant from government, this is not sustainable.
Yes, I mean, I have to agree with that. And in our reflections on human rights, while I do agree with the other speakers on money is not the only way, or fiscal policy is not the only way to target these things. You can't just throw money at a problem. It could be a bottomless pit. I think it is also crucial to recognize that we have made gains over the past decade in terms of lifting people out of poverty, and it's fiscal policy interventions, budget interventions that include things like the child support grants and adequate funding towards HIV/AIDS. For the past, since I was a child, so in the early 2000s and before the decade of fiscal consolidation, we've seen those increases translate into more people being on antiretroviral treatment, more people, access to social protection, health and education. And so we caution that maybe without elaborating on how we're going to protect these rights in the face of a weakening economic growth, knowing that more people are unemployed or struggle to find employment, more children, or the gap between women and children women and men who are living below the poverty line has widened, so there's a feminization of poverty. But by reducing the funding available to address that, to build the capacities of the various provinces to actually build schools, to overcome corruption, to build systems like a very capable public healthcare system, we end up even further reducing the efficiency of the spending. And so I think that yes, it is important to recognize that we do need fiscal balance. We need to make sure that we're fiscally sustainable as a country, but without recognizing or centering what is that fiscal sustainability, how does that trickle down or translate into human rights being realized? How do we make sure that we have a workforce that is healthy, a workforce that is educated in order to participate meaningfully in this economy? And without recognizing that and recognizing the power that fiscal policy has in protecting that, we risk having a situation where we have worsening economic growth, but equally also the burden of all of this being most carried by everyone in the country, but most carried by the most marginalized people, the underserved communities in this country.
But when are we going to have the real tough conversations? The conversations, because it's easy to scapegoat government in all of this. But what about the rest of us? When are we going to talk about whether, as a country, we should be providing child support grants for 5, 6, 7 children? At what point does the responsibility shift to the parents?
It is there already. It is resting already. Remember how many people are supporting what they call black tax. In fact, what we're seeing now with the difficulties is again the return to the extended family. So for example, my son is never in this environment domestically and internationally. We see in England, we see in America, whereby your children stay with you now. So they may go back to the old ways of extended families because we simply cannot afford. So we combine incomes. So there's quite a lot of that stuff that's being done by households.
But I'm making a different point.
Okay.
I'm making a completely different point in this regard. And what I'm saying is, and I feel these are the sort of really rough and tough conversations we need to have as a nation. For example, these grants, the childcare grant, for example, if we say as a nation, okay, you have your first child, it's a mistake. Yeah, we all make mistakes, government, we will help you as a nation. But how sustainable is it for the fiscus to have to pay for every child that someone has? And I know this is an unpopular opinion, but the point I'm driving at is, at what point do we start having real tough conversations? Because it can't just be that, grants need to be doled out to people willy-nilly. As I say, we understand at a point it needs to happen, but at what point are we going to sit back as a nation and talk about that? At what point are we going to talk about the fact that people need to pay for services in this country? One way or another.
Look, I think it's difficult, right? But I think there's a lot of work that has been done on the difference that social grants make. I know some of our colleagues at the University of Stellenbosch have been doing this work, and it's pretty clear from that research that social grants make a really huge positive difference to the recipients, right? So, and I think when I look at what the National Treasury is saying here, they're saying, we want to implement some expenditure cuts, but what they're not saying is we want to cut social grants. In fact, they're extending the social relief of distress grant by another year. They're making a provision for it for another year, even after that, because I think they know how important these grants are. So I think it's important in a country like ours, with unemployment rates so high, with inequality so bad, I think to protect some form of social welfare, because it's really critical. It makes a huge
difference
for the recipients of this grant.
I totally agree.
But your point is unconstitutional, though. Remember, we take everything that we do comes from our constitution. We've got our equality, we've got our Bill of Rights. So therefore, we can never, any temptation, because many people died for this constitution.
Yes.
So we must not go back there.
No.
Let's find other ways
But my
of how we
point
can
is,
address
and
these
I
challenges.
asked, at what point do we start having these uncomfortable conversations about how our social fabric as a society is something that we need to really introspect on?
But that requires a different conversation, though, because remember that a lot of what we see as ills in our society has to do with the political parties who are driving that because they need support. So whether it's the payment, it's the promise. People are told that you shall get free water, you will get free electricity, etc.
But why isn't that universal then?
But they've never gone back. They've never, these politicians
but why isn't
have
that
never
universal
gone back
then?
to say, look, guys, we just wanted votes. We didn't believe in this. We just wanted votes.
Guys,
they've never done that.
I have to leave it there.
Sorry.
And I hope we could have another discussion at a later point. Thanks so much to our guests in studio. We had a Constitutional Coalition Steering Committee member, Matshidiso Lencoasa. We also had Miyelani Maluleke, Senior Economist at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, and economist Lumkile Mondi from the Wits Business School, helping us dissect parts of the medium-term budget policy statement delivered by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. And I really want to hear your views.